If you have problems
Oh,
with the
yeah, yeah,
computer,
yeah.
that's a talking point. You can have problems with the computer.
You're not just hitting print on whatever the top 25 is, and that's your ballot.
Welcome back to the D3 Datacast. Be sure to like and subscribe to the show if you have not already. We're less than 50 subscribers away from 1,000. Zach, this is episode 96. Can't believe we've done 96 episodes already. Week 6 of the Division III basketball season this year. How are you feeling so far this year?
I'm feeling great. I can't believe it's episode 96. I can't believe it's week 6. Um, yeah, I feel like the season is going to fly by, and we're far enough into the season where we can really, I think, start to make some decisions and talk about some things based on what we've seen from the teams on the floor, Matt. And that's what we're going to talk about this week. Uh, there've been a bunch of teams that have been in the mix for, the top 25, and we're going to bring even more teams into the mix because I think we've identified a group of 10 teams that deserve to be in that mix. Maybe it's a watch list. Maybe it's breaking into some ballots as soon as this week. Even we got a good list. I think it's going to be a lot of fun to talk about.
Yeah, so here coming up is the top, I think, 10 teams who are the best teams according to our computer efficiency ratings who have received no votes so far in a D3Hoops.com top 25 balloting process. Let's go to the data.
So Matt, we've had a preseason poll, right? But voters have had two opportunities to react to early season games. So we've had a total of three polls, a preseason poll and two in-season polls. And over the course of those three voting opportunities, 79 different teams have been named on at least one ballot. But if you would think that 79 teams encapsulates the entire group of top 25 worthy teams, you would be wrong because, as we mentioned, we've got 10 more, Matt, that I think so far have proven themselves to be, at least in that mix, worth talking about. The computer thinks they're kind of in that top 50 mix at least. And so we're going to go. We've got on the screen here just an alphabetical list of all the 79 teams that have been named on a ballot so far. So you might think a team is really good that's on this list. We're not going to talk about them, not because they're not any good, but because they've already been on a ballot. We're talking about teams that haven't been on a ballot at all, Matt. And let's start with the top team according to the computer efficiency ratings that has not been on a ballot, and it's no stranger, Matt, in the Division III basketball world. It's Amherst, who the D3 Datacast computer likes as the number 7 team.
Yeah, they're a team no stranger to being in the top 25 consideration, no stranger to Final Fours or national championships. They've taken a little bit of a step back the last few seasons, but they were a team we talked about last week. I believe it's a week ago. I do not remember when we talked about teams on the rise, teams that have improved compared to their preseason computer projection that we set up for teams using the computer. So right here, the efficiency ratings that we run at d3datacast.com list the Mammoths as the number 7 team in the country already. So let's talk about that a little bit. You can see on the screen here a 105 offensive rating. That's only 121 in the country. So that's kind of just an okay so offensive rating. But defense, the number 1 defense in the country by the computer, 78.4. So the computer is really seeing some positive things here. As you can see, though, they've lost their 2 games against top 100 competition. They lost to WPI. The computer has them at number 10 overall, and they've lost to Marymount, who the computer has at number 53. Now, losing to like a top 50 range team wouldn't really disqualify you even at this point from top 25 discussion. I think most of the teams in the top 25 have taken a loss like that. But when you lose both of your opportunities, I think that gives human voters some pause. Right now, Amherst, that means they're doing a lot of their work against teams kind of ranked outside of the top 100, the computer's top 100s. They're putting up big margins against those teams. The computer sees that as meaningful. So far, the human voters have not, and I'm one of those human voters, because really you look at what's their best win. I think when we vote, we like to look at who's best wins, worst losses, types of things like that. Number 141, Western Connecticut, is their best win. So they've won some of these games between teams ranked in the 100s and 200s by big margins, and the computer tries to see that as significant. But so far, they have not had or taken advantage of the opportunities inside the top 100.
if we want to turn this into a little buy or sell game, Matt, I'm going to sell Amherst as a top 25 team right now,
Okay.
and certainly sell them as the number 7 overall team. As you mentioned, it seems like this is a lot of work being done against uh, average to bad Division 3 teams. We noted the 2 losses here in the top 100. Both of them were double-digit losses too. So this isn't even a case where, the computer's looking at the score of you know, um, like their game against WPI here and say, well, it was, like a 2-point game. So in that game, yeah, they lost, but they kind of played on par with the number 10 team. Um, it was actually a 14-point loss in that game. So for that to all come out with a number 7 ranking here, I'm a little dubious on, but I think it's clear Amherst could be in the mix here, a team to keep an eye on maybe going forward, even if we're a little bit dubious as to whether or not they
Yeah.
deserve that consideration right now.
Once they get into conference play, we know the NESCAC is strong. They're going to get opportunities against other good teams. So how many of those games do they win? How many of those scoring margins are close? That's going to be the real proof for Amherst here. Maybe not super shocked. They haven't played the most difficult schedule in the country at this point in the season, and they have lost their 2 kind of maybe toughest games so far. So we'll see where they end. We should also say on the screen here for the YouTube watchers, we're comparing to 2 additional computer ratings, both that we think very highly of. The Jacob Shower rankings, he has Amherst by his computer at number 19, so kind of in a similar top 25 range, not all the way up in number 7, but definitely in the top 25 consideration. And then also we have the Massey ratings rank at number 38 there, so some pretty positive things for Amherst overall. I should also note the Jacob Shower ratings and the Massey ratings are all through Saturday. The efficiency ratings here, we were able to calculate ourselves through Sunday. So that might change a little bit for some teams if they played or a team they played on Sunday, but it's as up to date as we could get here.
And great to see Amherst, as you mentioned, no stranger to the national scene. Good to see them at least showing that they're going to be a team to watch here going forward. Matt, this was a fun episode. I think we've done this both years now. Looking back last year, we talked about 7 teams. Clark was on that list. They did end up getting ranked in mid-January. 3 other teams, St. John's, Heidelberg, and Chicago, did end up getting votes. And at one point, St. John's, while they didn't break in, they were the top also receiving votes getter. So there's about kind of a 50-50 chance here as we're talking about some of these teams that at some point they do get votes, if not actually break into the top 25 at some point. All right, should we go on to our next team, Matt?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll go to Ohio. It's Ohio Northern, Matt, who the computer also really likes, similar to Amherst, with a number 14 overall ranking. Let's break down the Polar Bears.
Yeah, this week they had probably their best win so far. John Carroll, who's ranked at like number 60 overall by the computers. They're a team that has trended down. That is John Carroll after the injury to Luke Chacon. They do have a loss to number 76, Gettysburg, but the computer efficiency ratings that we run, D3Datacast.com, has Ohio Northern number 14 overall. Like I said, 1-point win against John Carroll. They also own a loss to number 209, Baldwin Wallace. They beat Vassar, Kenyon, Bluffton, Adrian, and Olivet, if those teams excite you, all by big numbers. So here is another example, and this might be a trend for some of these teams, that the computer tries to see significance in beating maybe middling teams, maybe in some of these teams are a little bit less than middling, by really big numbers, and says, okay, well, that still means you're probably good enough to hang with some of these better teams. Obviously, they did with John Carroll. They did have a loss to Gettysburg in the mix there. Comparing this to some of our friends, Jacob Shower, number 22, so very similar range. Massey ratings right now is a little bit skeptical, number 57. For me, at this point in the season, when I think of Massey ratings, it's always hard to know, since I don't know his system as intimately, how much of the data is in-season data, how much is still using a preseason prior. For me, Ohio Northern has 8 games played, so their preseason prior has washed out completely, and it's just looking at in-season data for Ohio Northern because they've passed that 8-game mark.
And a little bit different than what we talked about with Amherst, Matt. They do have that loss to Gettysburg, but it was a 2-point loss. So a computer is going to look at that and say it's a loss, but kind of a result that's on par with that opponent. At least, for that game. Obviously, the 14th ranking is much better than the 76. But then you add in a win over John Carroll, you add in some big margins over some lesser competition. It's a little bit of what we saw with Amherst, probably beating up on some bad teams. But overall, I think the computer does I don't want to say a better job, but takes more into account that margin over a bad team, whereas a human might just look at beating up on a bad team as like that's what you have to do. And whether it's, you beat them by 20, you beat them by 40, it there's a lot more diminishing returns in a human voter's mind than maybe in a computer system.
Yeah, and I think that can be a complicating factor in a computer system. You beat a team by 30 or 40. How different is that really than beating them by 25? The computer is going to give them some extra credit for those last 10 points, but how much? Not as much as the first 10 points you beat them by. So when you're creating a computer system, there's always that kind of aspect of it is, do you cap margin of victory, or do you have diminishing returns, or what do you do? I do have some sort of high low cap on offensive and defensive ratings inside of a game, so you can't just whip up on these terrible teams, because at some point maybe it's no different, like winning by 40 versus winning by 60 to a really, really bad team. Like that's maybe no different at all. I think another thing for Ohio Northern specifically is they've played a pretty road heavy schedule so far. So when you look at the scoring margins, like a 2-point loss at Gettysburg, with a home field advantage built in, that means they're as good, or the computer sees them as good, or maybe even slightly better than Gettysburg, because a home field advantage, I use about like 2.75 points, just under 3 points. So a 2-point loss, that's even if it's on the road, or maybe even slightly ahead. So the computer doesn't look at that as necessarily a negative, even though you ultimately lost. My system doesn't really care ultimately, did you win or lose? It just looks at those possessions and points scored and allowed, and then how good was the opponent. So a top 100 team on the road, 2-point loss, that's going to be a pretty positive result for a team like Ohio Northern.
And we've made this list entirely based on the total efficiency margin, Matt, but as displayed on the screen here, do have that broken out into the offensive number and the defensive number. Just we like to talk about the shape of teams sometimes. And here with Ohio Northern, I think it's worth pointing out the computer likes what they're doing on both ends of the floor, ranking number 11 offensively and number 41 defensively. So whether you're talking about offensive performance or defensive performance, the computer sees them as a top 50 team.
Yeah, pretty balanced there.
All right, moving on, Matt. Number 3 on our list here. It's the second NESCAC team. It's Hamilton. They do have a win over number 75 Utica. Took a loss to number 23 Stockton. 7-1 overall. And very similar shape to Amherst, where that offensive ranks outside the top 100, but the defensive rank is elite. Hamilton is number 25 by the D3 Datacast computer, but they have not received any actual votes in the D3Hoops.com top 25.
Yeah, I was going to start out just where you went with that. Another NESCAC team who's doing it largely on the defensive side, just like we saw with Amherst. Hamilton rates very well by our efficiency ratings. Defensively, a top 10 defense so far. They have 8 games played. Their one top 100 win is against Utica. That was by 18 points, though. So the computer looks at that quite favorably. They've won all their other games. Their only loss is against a number 25 Stockton team. So again, if you're just kind of looking at it just at a basic level, they lost to number 23. They beat number 75 by a bunch. They've beaten everyone else they've played. Like a number 25 ranking where our computer has them, or a number 30 ranking where Massey Ratings has them right now. That kind of makes some sense if you just kind of stack up opponents. Maybe not as good as 23, but maybe just behind that. Who knows? So that's where we have Hamilton. I think there's kind of a bunch of NESCACs ending up in this range right now. Some like Tufts and Middlebury have received, Williams received votes in the poll. There's a bunch of these NESCAC teams kind of ending up in that range. So it'll be really interesting come conference play to see how do things actually shake up. Is there going to be a pecking order established, or is there really a group of teams here that are all going to be maybe sort of tournament contenders kind of at the back end of this top 25 here?
Another team, Matt, that we talked about, I think, last week, and we wondered, is Mary Washington just going to do Mary Washington things? Another time to talk about that. Number 35 by the computer. Mary Washington's just 3-4, though. They've lost to Randolph-Macon, who the computer sees as the number 12 team, the number 33 team, Virginia Wesleyan, and the number 82 team, Marietta. They do have a top 100 win over Kane. All right, let's talk Mary Washington.
Yeah, it feels like this was the story with Mary Washington last year. They play a bunch of tough teams with that coast-to-coast conference schedule or no conference schedule, really. They're looking for games in and around the Virginia area. They end up playing a bunch of ODACs, and in fairness to them, they play a bunch of good ODACs, like we see Virginia Wesleyan and Randolph-Macon on the screen. It feels like they win a couple of those games, or they're right there in a bunch of those games. But last year and so far this year, they didn't really win the majority of those games. So I don't want to just peg that on Mary Washington. Like, that's really difficult to consistently play Randolph-Macon and Virginia Wesleyan and Marietta and win a bunch of those games. But it seems like, even though, like, they lost to Marietta by 5, I think, and Randolph-Macon by 2 or 3. Like, those were close. Big number wins against Kane and Maryville and Southern Virginia. So that's kind of, it was kind of the story with Mary Washington last year. The computer really loved them, even though they were kind of hovering over that, like, kind of 500 record for much of the year. At some point, as a human voter, I was just thinking it's too many losses. It's just, if you were really this good of a team, maybe you would have won a few more of those games. That's how I think the humans tend to see it. Although the computer is just thinking in bits and bytes, thinking scoring margins. They think, they're really just as good as some of these teams. So difficult to know what to do with it. Mary Washington all the time. It is a difficult schedule, but it's not always a lot of wins.
Right, and that, I think, is just very emblematic of what I think Mary Washington has been over not just last year, but several years, right? Like they'll get a couple wins on their resume. Maybe it's not showing up there quite yet this year, but they'll have some good wins that shows you what they are capable of. But then you look at the loss column, and it's just stacked up a little bit more than you would like to see. So it's like, okay, on a given night, this is a good team, and they play a bunch of good teams really tough, and they've got a couple good wins to show that, they are capable of winning those games, but end up falling short too often, probably for a top 25 voter. When you've got other options that are coming in at 7-1 or something like that at this point. You can only accept so many close losses. But the computer doesn't necessarily care. It says, how are you performing, compared to other teams? And if you're playing another team that the computer thinks is really good and you're losing to them by 4, the computer thinks, okay, you might not be that good, but you're still pretty good. And I don't really care what your 3-4 record is. You're performing like this kind of team.
Yeah. And we should say, as Calvin Knights fans this year, we know exactly how this goes. You play competitively with a bunch of good teams. You win a couple of them to show what you're capable of, but ultimately, maybe not quite there ranking-wise with those other opponents.
Yeah. Beating St. John's and La Crosse are good wins, but you're not going to get ranked at 2 and 6.
Yes.
Just because you've lost to a bunch of other good teams. All right, Matt, let's those are some names that are pretty familiar, and conferences that are pretty familiar to the top 25 picture. If not Ohio Northern, you're at least talking an OAC team there. Let's go off the board a little bit more here, Matt, with St. Joseph's, Maine. In the GNAC, it feels like okay, St. Joseph, Connecticut, that's a given. Albertus Magnus has kind of given that conference a second one, but St. Joseph's, Maine here, Matt, has kind of stood out, at least to the computer, here in the early season.
Yeah, another team we talked about last week as a team on the rise, a team that's improved their station from the preseason projections. Coming in is like a big disparity between the efficiency ratings, number 41, the Jacob Shower ratings, number 58. Those are kind of fairly similar-ish. And then Massey ratings, number 131. So another big gap here. St. Joseph's has a team that had maybe struggled more the last couple of seasons. So if Massey is still using more historical information, the Massey computers might be a little bit more skeptical of the St. Joseph's program than the efficiency ratings. Again, they're at 8 games, so it's all in-season numbers for them. Or the Shower rankings. Since they're more similar, my guess is the two priors there are more similar. But St. Joseph's, a loss at number 10 WPI, a loss at number 36 St. Joseph, 2 really good teams that they have not been able to win. they have those 2 losses plus a third loss, all on the road, which again, road losses will kind of make that scoring margin a little narrower than it would otherwise appear. And that WPI loss was by only 7 points as it was. So the computer looks at that and says that's a pretty favorable team. There's a lot of teams that are still pretty good who are going to lose at WPI by 7 points. So doesn't give you a bad computer rating for that game necessarily. Especially here, we're past the point where really we're talking about teams in top 25 consideration right now. We're talking about teams that maybe are on the cusp, or if they put together some more wins, could continue to climb in those rankings. At number 41, you're not like, this team needs to be in the top 25. But really for St. Joseph's, the way I see their schedule, most of their toughest games, like at WPI, at St. Joseph, they're already played. It's mostly a GNAC schedule that remains. They have a couple of games, had like maybe Alberta still remains. So we'll have to see what they do. But if they start muddling around in the GNAC, I think we're going to see their rating fall. If they can continue what they've been doing, putting up big numbers against a lot of the GNAC, maybe they can stay in this range and be kind of a, can they win that Pool A, make some noise in the tournament type of a team. I don't think they have a ton of opportunities remaining to play another team like a WPI. I don't even know if they play St. Joseph again this year. So it might be just kind of more of a GNAC schedule. So we'll have to see what that does to their computer rating. The computer's going to want to see a lot of large margins to continue to keep St. Joseph kind of in like a top 50 range.
Yeah, which is what they have. Again, going back to how a computer might view a margin compared to a human top 25 voter, a 33-point win over Husson, a 40-point win over Maine Farmington. That's probably going to register a lot more with a computer rating than it would a top 25 voter.
Yeah. Even though a team like Husson's a team we've seen in the NCAA tournament, so not a bad program, not an elite program, but still a pretty good win for a school like St. Joseph's.
Right. And that's why then, like in a computer rating, you win that game by 33, and suddenly that looks like a more significant result than would probably be weighed by a human voter looking to whether it's actually ranking in the top 25, or just does this look like a team I need to be keeping a closer eye on?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Next up, Matt, the number 39 team in the D3 Datacast computer is Chicago out of the UAA. It's off to a 6-2 start here. They've just played one top 100 game here, Matt, and that accounts for one of their losses, losing to Illinois Wesleyan.
Yeah, it's a loss to Illinois Wesleyan, but it's by 6 points. They're the computer's number 28 team. That's a pretty good loss, a pretty reasonable loss. That's a loss a lot of teams will take. So that's a pretty solid loss that the computer will compute and say, not too bad, not disqualifying by any stretch of the imagination. On the other side of that, they had a 2-point home loss to Lake Forest. The computer thinks they're number 314. That's not super good. So it's been a little bit of a mixed bag for Chicago. Other than that, though, let's leave those two a little bit of extremes aside, or those 2 losses aside. All the results have been pretty good wins. The 6 wins that they do have, kind of in between the number 100 and number 200 range, and it's all by pretty good margins that you think that they should be beating. So if you win a bunch of those games against teams in the top 100, the computer says, hey, you're in that next group up. You should be kind of more above the top 100. So Chicago here ranking in at number 39, and this ranking has pretty decent agreement with the Jacob Shower rankings at number 41 and the Massey ratings at number 53. They kind of all see these at CU Chicago as not a top 25 team, but a team that's maybe in that next group. Maybe you could keep on your watch list, see if they make a run in the UAA, then you can maybe move them in to the top 25. Not right now. You're not voting them right now, but you want to keep an eye on what Chicago's doing and maybe where they'll move in the future.
And we started doing that a couple weeks ago with that Illinois Wesleyan game in our segment where we were taking a look at some ranked versus unranked games. That was one, not because we thought that was necessarily going to be an upset, not calling that upset, although it turned out maybe even more of a competitive game than we thought it would be. But that was really what it was about. It's coming into the season. I know there was some sentiment that Chicago could, be taking a step forward, be a lot more competitive in that UAA mix. And so having seen what we had seen from Illinois Wesleyan, it's like, okay, what's this going to look like when Chicago takes them on? And I think they passed that test. Yeah. And certainly they're going to have a lot more opportunities in UAA play to stake a claim whether it be to a top 25, ballot or not, remains to be seen. But those opportunities are definitely ahead of them, and they're kind of in the mix here.
Yeah.
Let's move on to the ODAC, Matt. Here, this is one of the teams that kind of emerged last year, off to a good start this season. Ferrum is number 43 in the current computer rankings, off to a 6-0 start. But no games, wins or losses, no games in the top 100 currently. So a little bit of a different strength of schedule profile here, maybe compared to what we've seen. I think this is the first blank across the board there in terms of top 50 and that next 50 in the top 100.
Yeah, as you mentioned, they're undefeated. Haven't played a top 100 game yet, at least as our computer sees their opponents. But all of their games, all of their wins have been by double digits. So they haven't really played anyone close. So again, that's another example where they're playing competition that's maybe not in the upper quartile of Division 3. And you're beating them all soundly, so maybe the computer sees you as in that next group up. Efficiency ratings at number 43, the Jacob Shower ratings at number 23, the Massey ratings at number 43. So I think there's a fair bit of agreement there. The Jacob Shower ratings are maybe a step above, maybe saying, hey, yeah, you could consider voting them in the top 25 right now. The efficiency ratings here on D3Datacast.com and the Massey ratings say maybe they're on your watch list, that next group. But either way, I think Ferrum's on the map. They're going to get the opportunity, as everyone does in that conference, through the teeth of the ODAC season, to play some of these other top teams. So we're gonna by the end of the year, we'll know what Ferrum is. I think they've played maybe 2 ODAC games already, not against your Hampton Cities, your Randolph Macons, but they've gotten wins in those.
Yeah, and I wanted to mention one of those was over Averett, who was a team we talked about last week, and I think maybe as a result of that loss, ends up outside the top 100 currently. So maybe this is a way they kind of hurt their profile by winning, at least, in
a manner of
having
speaking,
in a manner of speaking, right. But we've talked about Averett is a team who has looked good, has maybe surprised a little bit. And so, Ferrum getting a win over them looks good. And you'd have to think Averett's been on the rise in the computer ratings. Maybe that continues as the season goes. If they continue to prove who it looks like they are through this early season portion here.
Yeah, and
their other win was over Lynchburg. So at least you're kind of talking about maybe that middle section of the ODAC, and starting 2-0, it shows, okay, if we're in that middle section of the ODAC, maybe we're kind of the start of that middle section.
Yeah. And we can say this is best teams without top 25 votes. As we were putting this episode together, we did see a ballot from Ryan Whitnable include Ferrum. So we know that they will be exiting this list on Monday night when the poll is released, that Ferrum will get at least one top 25 vote from Ryan Whitnable.
Yeah. And I don't believe Ryan Scott posted his ballot, but he did comment that he wanted to have room for Ferrum, but didn't.
Yeah.
So right there on the cusp on another ballot as well.
We know that they're on radars for sure.
They are definitely on radars. Next team to talk about, number 46, ranked by the computer, is Mary Hardin-Baylor, off to a 6-1 start. That one loss is to Trine, who the computer sees as the number 4 overall team, and it was a big loss, but they're able to back that up though with wins over number 42 St. Thomas and number 88 Heidelberg. So a good start for the crew.
Yeah, as you mentioned, it was a big loss, 28 points on opening night up at Trine. But really the funny thing is, when you're talking about a nationally elite team like Trine is, a 28-point loss on the road isn't a below average result. Like, that one result by that one big scoring margin is like, yeah, I mean, that's still like average, or like an averagey team could do that. So it doesn't really drag you down that much. You think of, best teams without top 25 votes, or teams that could be getting top 25 consideration. You have a 28-point loss in your schedule. That's not terrible, because it was one of the best teams in the country, just to start off. Mary Hardin-Baylor does have a couple of good wins on their resume. I think we've seen a lot of teams with some of their best, additional games being losses. They went out, and I think it was this last week, beat St. Thomas, who the computers have at number 42. The next night after losing to Trine, they turned around and beat Heidelberg, who's in the top 100 by our efficiency ratings. Since that Trine loss, they've gone 6-0. They've started winning some games, a bunch of games in a row there. They had a Sunday night overtime win at McMurray added to their resume. So I think Mary Hardin-Baylor is a team that is they're not the 28-point loss team that they showed on opening night. I think they've proven that they're better than that or a step ahead of that. And the computers are all now saying, hey, you're on that kind of the watch list. Massey ratings edging them up toward the top 25. So I think they are a team that voters should definitely be watching on their watch list, maybe including in their top 25s. And I think that there's going to be some of those votes out there for Mary Hardin-Baylor.
We've talked about ways that maybe some of these other teams we've already talked about are kind of computer darlings as opposed to how the way a top 25 human voter might look. I think this is the first one that really has some things on the resume that would resonate a bit more with a human voter. Those wins showing up against St. Thomas, against Heidelberg, and yeah, maybe the 28-point margin is not what a human voter would want to see when they take on Trine. I think kind of the opposite of how a human voter might have some issues or be less willing to contextualize what it means to beat a bad team by 40 or 50 points. Losing to Trine under those circumstances maybe gets diminished a little bit more by a human. Who knows? All right, Matt, we're 9 deep. We're still inside the top 50. We'll go to number 48 by the D3 Datacast computer with DeSales out of the Mac Freedom. A 5-3 start, so another team that's taken some losses here, including to number 50 Montclair State and number 72 Hood. So 2 of the 3 inside the computer top 100. Let's talk DeSales, Matt. How are you feeling about DeSales as a human voter? 5-3, not seeing wins showing up there. A little bit of a different case, I feel like, than what we just talked about with Mary Hardin-Baylor, despite being just 2 spots different in the computer rankings.
Yeah, DeSales is a team that honestly is not really even on my watch list. It's not that I'm not paying attention to them. I mean, I'm paying attention on some level to every team out there, but I'm not specifically paying a lot of attention to DeSales right now. To me, I don't see the results. And honestly, they're a team that I look through and I don't really know how the computer comes up with a number 48 rating. It's not completely out of left field. The Jacob Schauer ranking is number 69. That's not crazy different. Massey's sticking up there at 101, but we've seen Massey ratings out there on some of these teams. So let's just try to make the case, I guess. 2 of their losses, which is Widener and Hood, were both by 2 points. So, and the Widener one was on the road, so maybe that's not terrible losses. I know Widener's not as good as they were last year. I think Hood is still pretty good. They have wins over Baruch, Cairn, and Moravian, all by pretty convincing margins. And they're kind of averagey teams. They're not like elite teams, but they're both kind of around that midline of Division III. So I think that's the case for DeSales, is they've beaten those kind of average teams by double figures. I don't completely see it. I'm going to trust the computer is doing its computer thing. But again, as a human voter, I'm not really excited to vote for DeSales. Again, the computer's not saying I should either, but they're not really a team I think that's even really on the cusp of getting votes for me.
And then one more team will go down 2 more spots in the computer rankings to number 50, Montclair State. They're off to a 5-2 start. Both of those losses inside the top 100 against a road game at Wesleyan, who the computer sees as the number 5 team. Another one of those NESCACs really jumping out in the early season. The other loss was at Rowan, number 59 by the computer, and they do have a good win to their credit against DeSales, Matt, the team we just talked about. So you talked about DeSales not even really being on your radar. I mean, it seems to me like probably Montclair, maybe they're not quite there yet either, but they would be ahead in line compared to DeSales.
Yeah, we talked about this a little bit with Mary Hardin-Baylor. Their resume is a little bit more like one that would resonate with a human voter. Both of their losses are inside the top 100, so it's not terrible to lose to Wesleyan or to Rowan. They've beaten another pretty good team like DeSales. These 3 computer systems really have a large amount of agreement with Montclair State, where they kind of rank kind of in that 50 to low 60s range. So pretty close there. Again, not a team I'm going to vote for, but it's the resume that makes sense to me to be where they are. They haven't lost. They have only 2 losses, and they're both in the top 100. They haven't lost outside of that group. They have one group in there. Like, to me, I would be having Montclair State like closer to a watch list than I'd have a team like DeSales, just because I know they're going to cause trouble. They've caused trouble for other teams. Maybe it's a little bit of the NJAC of it all. I know they all seem to be like up for beating anyone on any given night, but then also maybe losing to anyone on any given night. But again, I trust the resume a little bit more in that they're beating the teams they're supposed to. They're losing to the teams they're supposed to. So they're kind of makes sense of where they're falling. We're not really having to rely on, well, they beat these other teams by a whole bunch. And so that's why we can justify a loss to number 200 or whatever. Again, not a team I'm going to vote for right now, but it makes sense to me that they'd be kind of in that second group, that second 25 or so of Division III.
Yep. And both of those losses, the computer really likes Wesleyan. That was only a 3-point loss. And then, at Rowan, kind of a similarly ranked team, road conference game, there was a 5-point loss. So even the losses, I think, help them out in putting them forward as a potential team to keep an eye on. All right, Matt. So now to put the pressure on you, because we talked about, I don't know if we mentioned it, Matt. We talked about Ferrum getting a vote on Ryan Whitnable's ballot. I don't think we mentioned it, but I believe Mary Hardin-Baylor will also be breaking in this week. Bob Quillman posted his ballot. I believe he has Mary Hardin-Baylor in as his 24th or 25th team. So that's 2 teams we know are going to get votes this week, get themselves off this list. Matt, you are a voter, so this is in your hands. You have the ability to single-handedly move the needle on this topic. So let's get into your ballot for this week. Are you choosing to vote for any of these teams that we just talked about that had not previously received votes?
I am pulling the trigger on Mary Hardin-Baylor at the end of my ballot here at number 25. I wasn't sure, were they going to be 24, were they going to be 25, or were they going to be like 26, 27, just out? I was waiting till the end of their game, went into overtime. I didn't love, honestly, that it was in overtime against McMurray, but I think ultimately, as we talked about, they do have some wins on the resume that make me as a human voter more confident that they deserve and they fit in on this type of position than a team like even Ohio Northern, even though they beat John Carroll by the point this week. They also feels like relying on still a lot of wins against maybe like third tier type competition. I just want to see a little bit more from a team like Ohio Northern. They're definitely on my radar. Not quite there for me. Similar for Ferrum, we mentioned like no games versus the top 100. So I don't begrudge anyone voting either of those teams. I think they're deserving of being in the conversation. I would understand it for sure. But for me, Mary Hardin-Baylor was the team that I could put like, okay, I see what some of the results were, and I like some of those results. Like a team like St. Thomas, Texas was on my watch list like a week ago. Like winning a game like that, I think is something I like to point to as a human voter, where I can say, yes, I want to vote for Mary Hardin-Baylor here above, say, Randolph-Macon, because I think on a neutral court, that would be an interesting game, or a game that Mary Hardin-Baylor could win, let's say. Whereas I'd be less confident some of those other teams we talked about, Amherst, I really have no idea what to do with them yet, even though the computer loves them. I just want to see a more competitive game that they can win before I really put them in that mix.
And you may not have loved that the Mary Hardin-Baylor win was in overtime today, but that was an entertaining game.
Yeah.
They were down 6 at halftime. I think I don't know if it topped out at 8. I know they were down 8 in the second half. Just kind of kept their cool. Ended up taking a nice lead, and then it was 3-pointer, steal, 3-pointer, and a 6-point lead late evaporated, and suddenly it was back in overtime. But it was a very good, interesting overtime back and forth. But it was a road game, never got rattled. They kind of, kept their cool, took care of business in the end. And that's just, sometimes that just happens. And I thought it was a good show of basketball character for that team to just kind of be even and roll with the punches a little bit. May not have gone how they wanted it, or how you as a top 25 voter wanted to see it go. But in the end, good stuff, I thought, from UMHB.
Yeah. Some other ballot highlights here for me. Trine fell out of the top spot to number 3. They lost to UW-Stevens Point this week. So Emory is my new number 1. Trinity, Connecticut in at 2. And then there I said Trine at number 3. Wash U rounds out the top 4. Hampton-Sydney at 5. They had another win against Randolph-Macon. They've already beaten Randolph-Macon twice this year, I think. And then Illinois Wesleyan slides to 6. They took a loss this week to Carthage. Yes, they lost to Carthage at home. I'm not going to kill Illinois Wesleyan for that. They've still, I think, played and won some good games. I still think that they're in that top 10 mix for me. So number 6, I feel pretty good about. And you and I saw them in person really take it to number 8, who I have number 8, UW Platteville. So I think I still feel good about that one. In between those two teams at number 7 is NYU. And then I'll just do my top 10. Finish up the top 10. Number 9 is Worcester, and number 10 is Wisconsin Lutheran. And then I guess since I already mentioned them, UW-Stevens Point checks in for the first time on my ballot all the way up at number 11. They're undefeated. I didn't think they had any good wins yet until they beat Trine really impressively, so they jump in all the way at number 11.
You want to read the rest of the list for the benefit of our audio-only listeners?
I can. I don't know if I was boring you, but number 12 is Stockton, number 13 Catholic, 14 Whitworth, 15 Wesleyan, 16 WPI, 17 Tufts, 18 Keene State, 19 UW La Crosse, 20 Christopher Newport, 21 UW Oshkosh, 22 Oswego State, 23 St. John's, 24 Roanoke, and 25 Mary Hardin-Baylor.
Now, I don't know if you've had this thought, Matt, but I started thinking as I've looked at today's update for the computer ratings, and even just taking a quick glance. I know we haven't talked NPI a lot, but I took a quick glance, and I'm just wondering if this season is setting up for the NESCAC to be like last year's ODAC. I'm seeing we talked about it with Amherst, with Hamilton in this topic here. You've got Trinity at 2, Wesleyan at 15, Tufts at 17. Williams had been in the top 25 mix, took another loss. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. This is kind of just ambushing you with a random topic. But as I'm seeing a bunch of teams getting stacked near the top, whether we're talking the computer ratings, whether we're talking NPI, which this is very early season. This is such a dynamic system. I think that we're going to see a lot of changes over the course of not only, what's left to play out this season, but even over the final maybe week of the season. But just seeing so many teams now, who knows, maybe they all beat each other up and they kind of fall down, but to some extent there was a lot of beating each other up in the ODAC. And that just kind of proved that there's a 4, 5, 6 team mix that was in that, top 25, top 40 mix. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I've been thinking about that too, because I did kind of a really way too early silly bracketology, and I think there's at least 4, maybe 5 NESCACs in there. And I think maybe this top half of the NESCAC, and I think you mentioned them, kind of like your Tufts, your Wesleyans, your Williams, your Amhersts, your Middleburys, Hamilton, we already talked about in this episode. I think they've already gotten a bunch of wins in non-conference. That's going to, once you start playing conference games, if you've gotten a bunch of wins, it's going to help your NPIs. I think we could see 4 or 5 NESCAC teams make the tournament this year. Yeah, and I think we have a mailbag question that gets into some of this a little bit, not specifically on the NESCAC side. So we'll talk about it there in the mailbag too. But I think yes, you're right. I think that's an astute observation to call out the NESCAC specifically in that regard.
It's just a trend I was noticing that NESCAC was showing up quite a bit in the top of a few different types of rankings there. So something to keep an eye on. This might be a NESCAC season.
Yep.
All right, let's roll into the picks, Matt. We have to do it. We have to review last week's picks, as much as I or you, I'm sure, do not want to do it. Let's just let's take the lumps and move on.
Yeah, it was road heavy. Up at the first game, Stockton was 8-point underdogs. They won that game outright. So I got that point. Zach, you missed that one. Mount Union was 2.5-point underdogs at John Carroll. They won that game outright by 11. Zach, you got that one correct. Hardin-Simmons was at Whitman. Whitman was a 4-point favorite. We both went with the Blues, but Hardin-Simmons won that game big, 76-58. So we both missed that one. Redlands against Cal Lu. The line was 2.5. Um, and Cal Lu won by 2. So we both
Yeah.
missed that pick by the half a point. Redlands was up late in that game too. Cal Lu pulled it out, but Redlands was able to cover that computer line. We both miss. Our game of the week was Carthage at Illinois Wesleyan. We were not shy about the 8.5-point line. The problem was, though, that Carthage won the game outright, crushing our line and crushing our chances at having a good week in the picks. So we both finished 1-4. And you are overall 8-17, Zach. That is really embarrassing. I'm overall 10-15. That is also really embarrassing. We were rather successful the first year, especially. Last year, fairly successful, and this year so far has been terrible. So what do you say we pick it up a notch and go to this week's and get some wins under our belt?
Let's do it. A lot of ball game left.
As a reminder, these are the computer lines that our efficiency rating sets for each of these games. First game is Farmingdale State. 4.5-point underdogs at Swarthmore. Zach, who do you like in this matchup?
I like Swarthmore. I feel like I don't know how good exactly they will be, Matt, but I feel like they're a team I can start to trust in a pick here. 4.5 is not a huge line. Give me Swat.
All right, congrats to the Farmingdale Rams because I am also picking Swarthmore here at plus 4.5 points. I agree. I think they're a team. They just beat Johns Hopkins. We liked what we saw to Johns Hopkins at the GLI. I just think Swarthmore is a little bit more tested at this point, although Farmingdale's played some good games too. But I expect, even though it's 4.5, it's getting towards a big line there. I think I will pick the Garnet in that one. In a neutral site game, we have Mary Hardin-Baylor, 2.5-point favorites against Cal Lutheran. This is going to be held up at Whitman. Zach, your pick.
I'm going to give the 2.5 and go with Mary Hardin-Baylor here, Matt, as a trying to get on the right track here. I think that the style of game will be one that Mary Hardin-Baylor will be comfortable with. Give me the crew.
Zach, I am the Mary Hardin-Baylor voter, as we just showed, and yet I am going to go with Cal Lutheran in this one. I will take the 2.5 points and go with the Kingsmen. It's going to be a good game. This is what I'm interested in to watch. It's purple and gold all around, but I'm going to go with Cal Lutheran. Denison, one of the upstart teams in Region 7, is going up against the two-time UAA champion, Case Western Reserve, but it's Denison who are 8-point favorites by the computer. Zach, what do you like?
I'm going to go with Case Western Reserve here, Matt, with the big 8 points getting the 8 points at home. It just feels like too big of a number. I know it feels like teams who have really swapped fortunes for this season. Denison has been off to a good start, and Case has really struggled, including a big loss to Kalamazoo. Surprising to see. Just not what we've come to expect from the Spartans. But so maybe I'm falling into a trap here, Matt. But that just feels like an awful lot of points to be giving Denison or to be giving Case in a home game. So give me the home team. Give me the home dog.
If you're falling into a trap, then I'm right there behind you. I see Case Western Reserve and Denison. I see 8 points toward Denison, and I think, no, Case has got to be able to cover that. Maybe this is the game where we finally cast off our expectations of Case being that kind of top-level team, or maybe it's just Denison proving that they are actually that top-level team this year. But I can't trust it for the second right now, so I'm going to say Case covers the 8 points. We've got a even bigger line next as UW Whitewater goes to face Virginia Wesleyan in kind of a fun kind of cross-country matchup here. 12.5 points, though, is the line in favor of the Marlins. Zach, what's your pick?
My pick is Whitewater just because of the number there, Matt. The 12.5 feels too big. Watch it be 12 and we'll be, in the final seconds and we'll be sweating it out.
Yeah. Your bubble says Virginia Wesleyan, but you're actually picking Whitewater?
I moved my bubble. My bubble says Whitewater.
Well, I didn't reset my slides then. Okay, well, let's pretend Zach's bubble says UW Whitewater. Mine also says UW Whitewater in a boring pick. Interesting game, but maybe a boring pick. Line too big. Go Whitewater. That is my analysis on that one. Our D3 Datacast game of the week: St. Joseph, Connecticut, Trinity, Connecticut. Both teams from Connecticut. 12.5-point favorites, though, from the computer darling Trinity, Connecticut. What is your pick?
This is my opportunity to fall into yet another trap, Matt, because we had this Trinity team with a 17 and a half
Yeah.
point game or line against Yeshiva. We felt that was too big. And as it turned out, 37 and a half wouldn't have been too big for that game. But I'm going to take the 12 and a half. Give me St. Joseph. I think, that that Trinity Yeshiva game really got out of hand in the second half. It really snowballed. But the thing is, the Bantams are more than capable of doing that. They've done that to a number of teams. We'll see if they can do it against USJ, though. I'll take the 12 and a half for now.
Okay, we're going to pretend that your bubble correctly says St. Joseph on my screen as well. But I'm going with Trinity on this one. I saw that Yeshiva game, and I thought Trinity looked really, really good. I think St. Joseph is probably a little bit better than Yeshiva is right now. So maybe 12 and a half is too big, but I'm going to go with the Bantams. I'm voting them highly. The computers love them. I'm going to say that 12 and a half is okay, no problem, and I'm going to go that direction. So your picks, just to recap, because the bubbles are wrong on the screen, you have SWAT, you have Mary Hardin-Baylor, you have Case, you have UW Whitewater, and you have St. Joseph.
Correct.
All right. Those were the picks.
Yeah, I think two late picks didn't, or late changes didn't make it into your version.
I
there.
must not have refreshed my screen. Okay, so do we have a mailbag?
We have a mailbag. Let's start off here with the first one from Max Fan at Go Maccabees on the social media platform known as X. Which teams do you/the computers predict to have the strongest non-conference schedule come end of year? Particularly interested in where Calvin and Yeshiva stand. Matt, you already made mention to the non-conference schedule that Calvin has played. Similarly, Yeshiva has a number of top 25 teams on their non-conference schedule. So at this point in the season, we've got some non-conference games that have already been played, and we have some non-conference games that are yet to be played. By the time we get to the end of the year, looking back, what do you think for these two teams, or if there's someone else that you think has a chance to have like the number one non-conference strength of schedule?
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure. Both of these teams, two teams mentioned, have really strong non-conference strength of schedules right now. For Calvin in particular, their average opponent efficiency margin is 18.3. That's like kind of like number 30 overall in the country territory that the average opponent for Calvin has been. That also means that Calvin's opponents would tend to beat an average team by about 13 points. So they've played strong teams. That's the number 3 non-conference strength of schedule played so far to date. So far, Yeshiva's non-conference opponents have been plus 11.9, which is the number 19 overall non-conference schedule played to date. So two very good ones. Rowan actually is number 1 in non-conference strength of schedule by average opponent efficiency margin to date at about plus 20. So like you're talking about like a top 25 team on average that Rowan has played in the non-conference. Unfortunately, how my computer is set up right now, I don't have a number showing opponents through the end of the season. Like I know Yeshiva has a game against NYU still to play. I think Calvin has finally played most of their most difficult non-conference games, 8 of them. So hopefully they'll get a couple of games that are maybe a little bit more winnable going forward. So it's something we're going to have to monitor to see at the end of the season who has the best non-conference strength of schedule by the computers. I don't have a great way to predict it right now. I could probably come up with one if I spent some time doing it, but I probably won't spend that time, to be honest, right now. So we'll have to keep an eye on it. But yeah, both have played strong strength of schedules in the non-conference, and both will finish highly in the number for sure.
Well, and why don't you go ahead and remind all the viewers how they can continue to monitor that as more games get played, because that is something that is tracked and it is out there as the games continue to mount.
Yeah, if you go to D3Datacast.com and you go to the top efficiency ratings, kind of like banner drop-down menu, and you click on men's basketball, one of the columns, I think it's all the way to the far right, is called NCSOS. That's non-conference strength of schedule, and it shows the average opponent's efficiency margin and what the ranking is for each team. So you can go look up any team in the country. Those are numbers played to date, so it's all the non-conference opponents. One caveat on that is I believe it only looks to see if a team is in your conference, so it will count. It won't. If you play a non-conference game against a team in your conference, it won't include that number in the non-conference strength of schedule. I don't have that all sussed out for that portion of the ratings.
All right. So that number is a to-date number, but by the time we get through all of non-conference play, that'll give you the answer that Max Fan was trying to get an advanced glimpse of.
Yes.
Which unfortunately we're not set up to give.
Yep.
Mailbag number 2 comes to us from Scott Peterson, and it's a 2-pack. Number 1, what can the common fan take from current NPI rankings? Let's start with that one, Matt. We've talked about it a little bit. Now, the NCAA has not started officially releasing the NPI numbers for this men's and women's basketball season, but they can be found at d3datacast.com/NPI. We are tracking that with daily updates. So, Matt, if someone were to go and look, is there something that you feel at this early stage of the season that the common fan could take from checking those out?
Yeah, I think teams are starting to get in a directional order. I think if you're high, that is good. If you're lower, that is not as good. But I think there's a couple of things to keep in mind. One is that NPI is going to change all the time. If you win a game or you lose a game, your results will reflect that. How good of a team did you beat, or how bad of a team did you lose to? Things will still change drastically because we've still played relatively few games. I would say most teams have played about 8 games so far. The next thing to keep in mind is that the way that the NPI works, especially with regards to the minimum wins threshold, which I think is 12.5 for men's basketball, means we're not going to get to the point where teams are allowed to drop wins that would hurt their NPI, so their wins against the very worst teams, until we get to that 12.5 threshold. So until a bunch of teams have met that with 12.5 adjusted wins, I think we're going to see a lot of movement in the NPI. You could win a game against a bad team and your NPI won't move very much. You could beat a really good team and you could make a big jump. So I think the only thing we're taking right now is kind of directionally where teams are. But it's not at all set in stone. It's still very fluid. I should also say probably a really big thing is not all teams will have the same opportunity to improve their rating going forward as other teams will. When we were talking about top teams without any votes, we talked about St. Joseph's, Maine, and I said most of their top games are already behind them. That means the games they've already played that can most improve their NPI are already played. A team like Amherst, a team like most of the NESCACs, have not played their NESCAC schedule yet. So a bunch of games that can most improve their NPI are still to be played. So those are the teams, if you have a bunch of strong games ahead of you, you can really improve your NPI by winning a bunch of those really good games. If you're in a weak conference and you have a bunch of you kind of like 300 rated teams behind you, you're only going to have so much opportunity to improve your NPI. So you're going to have wanted to do a lot of work already in the early season. So again, not a lot of like truths we can take out of where teams are ranked, but just maybe kind of know that what's your opportunity to improve? Where's the minimum win threshold? When can you stop dropping wins? Those kind of things are what to keep in mind.
And we'll have to see how accurate this is, but for me, I was looking a little bit more just to see what conferences are showing up multiple times towards the top end, and that is maybe an indication of what conferences are being positioned potentially to be multi-bid leagues. We'll have to see. There's a lot to change, and on a more just like team by team basis, I think it is starting to show which teams have a solid foundation or are building a base for their NPI. Now, again, I think what we're going to find as we get later in the season is this is going to feel a lot more dynamic than the old system is. By the time we got to game 25, 26, and you're looking at just changes in winning percentage and strength of schedule, when you're talking about, one additional game over 25 or 26 that have already been played, you're not going to see a lot of movement from week to week as the regional ranking time was playing out. But there can be bigger shifts in NPI. I think we've seen that in some of the fall sports, and so I think there's going to be a different mindset that we're going to need to have as we get into what has been that traditional regional ranking season. So I don't want to suggest that teams are in any way locking themselves into anything at all. But again, if you're a team that has a bunch of wins and you're showing up near the top of the list, you probably feel better about that than a team who has a bunch of wins and is further down the list. A better base to work with, I guess. Let's go to the second one here. How would you evaluate Trine's loss to Wisconsin Stevens Point? What is your voting philosophy around losses? does the losing team have to drop? Now, Matt, let's I'm going to throw in a different dynamic here as it pertains to Trine, because I think at least in some voters' minds there would be a bit of deference to Trine as the number one team because they are the defending champion. They bring a bunch of players back. Um, they were the preseason number one, and then like I said, I think there's a little bit more reason to be deferential towards Trine number one as the defending champ, and waiting for them to lose to make any sort of different judgment there as to who to rank number one. That's a little bit unique, I think, maybe to maybe a defending champ that just saw everyone graduate, or another number one team, just at a random point during the season.
Yeah, I was trying not to vote for Trine just because they won last year. I was voting for Trine highly because they were getting results on the court this year as well.
Sure.
They've played a good schedule. They've won a bunch of those games. So from that standpoint, what did I drop them to, like 3 this week? They're still like one of my top teams in the country. So I didn't drop them very far. I didn't automatically put them behind UW Stevens Point, even though Stevens Point is undefeated and have a win over Trine. I think Trine's played a really good schedule and gotten some really good wins. So I'm happy with Trine where they are. I don't think so. I mean, if you're the number one team and you take a loss, do you always have to drop? No. What if you're 14-0 and everyone else is 13-3 or worse, right? And you take a loss to another pretty good team, that doesn't mean you have to even drop out of the number one spot. A top 25 though team, almost by necessity, is probably has lost to a team worse than them. Like, it's just likely that that's who the team that they lost to. So you might be considering dropping them a little bit, but it's just, I think, a data point in a sea of data points that moves them slightly. I try to avoid the, well, you lost, so you dropped 2 spots, or unless 2 teams are close, like really close, like you directly lost to this team, so I'm gonna flip the order. I'm gonna make sure you're behind them. I try not to play that game too much because it gets pretty complicated or circular. I just try to evaluate how good do I think this team is overall, how good do I think is the other team overall, and then I try to place them. If they're placed very, very close and I've seen a convincing head-to-head game, then I might bump a team higher or lower than I otherwise would have. But again, in this case, I was happy to keep Trine overall pretty high. Not number one. I've seen Emory. I think Emory's great, and I was happy to put Emory number one as well, as long as they're continuing to play well.
And sometimes a game like that says more about a team like Stevens Point than it does about Trine. And I think in what we saw in the movement, that's the position you take, right? Stevens Point moves way up into, what did you have him, number 11? And while Trine makes a small move down. So that's you recognizing, well, it's more like Stevens Point looks closer to like where Trine was than Trine looks closer to where Stevens Point was. And I think this is the fun too of a top 25 poll or power rankings, right? I mean, if you're just looking for standings, you don't need voters for that. Just go look at standings and it's just a matter of record. But this is more opinion. If Trine played Stevens Point tomorrow, who do you think would win? Well, I think a lot of people would still expect that Trine would be the favorite, right? So I think it's fair, even though with the head-to-head on that day, Trine lost to Stevens Point. It's certainly fair to continue to rank Trine ahead of Stevens Point, especially in the added context of everything else we've seen so far. Trine has posted some fabulous results, were previously undefeated and just had some huge wins over good teams. They played a strong schedule. So it wasn't like my comment about being deferential to them as a defending champ was in lieu of what they were actually doing on the court. It's just that you'd need a little bit of a stronger reason to vote someone else until they took a loss. And now that this opens up a little bit more space maybe for some additional analysis, but entering the season as a defending champ and then getting off to the start that they did, I think it was perfectly reasonable to not really have to look beyond Trine or for any reasons to vote for someone else. And but that space is now open, I think, with that loss.
And also with regards to wins and losses specifically, if Trine had won this game by a bucket, maybe I still move UWSP into my top 25. If you can play within a bucket of Trine, even though it was a loss, they were a team that was just outside my top 25, depending on all the other results, right? They might have moved up into my top 25, seeing that as a positive result of their overall. They were a team that had some good wins, but against like how good is the competition level? Okay, if they can play up with a team like Trine, maybe you move in even with a loss. That doesn't have to necessarily move you quote unquote down.
And we already saw that this season with Anderson's game against Trine.
Yeah.
I believe it was a 5-point margin.
Yep.
And so it's like, okay, well, that says well for an Anderson team that we were kind of wondering about, who had, some good early season results. And it's like, okay, here's another really good measuring stick. Let's see how you do against this one. A 5-point loss. It's like, okay, you lost the game, but you come out looking fairly good.
Yeah.
All right, one more here, Matt, from Ryan Wensing. What's Worcester's ceiling if Ashton Price is out long term, and is ONU legit?
I mean, we talked about ONU in this episode. I don't know that Ryan knew we were going to talk about them necessarily in this episode, although you maybe teased that on social media. I think ONU is good. Like we mentioned, they're a little bit wait and see for me. I want to see how they do consistently against better competition. I think they're good, but like the question is like, are they good or are they good, right?
We talked about like the computer thinks they're legit so far with what the computer knows, right? So we'll see how that continues.
Yeah. And with Worcester and Price, I don't know the details with him. He did not play in their game against Case this weekend. It was a 7-point win. He had started the previous 6 games. I don't know if that's, short-term, long-term, or whatever. I don't know. He averaged 20 points per game, so that's definitely a big player for them. As Calvin fans, we know what it's like to not have a 20-point per game scorer available in the lineup, and you always wish that they were there. But so Price is a big player for Worcester. I think they have a little bit of a stretch here where maybe they have, I shouldn't say a lull in competition, but they have some winnable games. So maybe that they can come through if he's going to be out for a while. Again, I don't know any details on his status. But yeah, it'll be different for them. I think we have to see how those results go. And if they're a team that can still stay in the mix. I think NCAC is very winnable this year. So I think Worcester had solidified themselves as the favorite. So we'll have to see how that goes.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And, it's a lot of scoring production to be missing from your lineup, but it doesn't look like they really struggled to score points against Case Western. And, maybe
defend.
that some of those games tend to be a little bit higher scoring. So maybe that's, again, sometimes results say more about one team than another, but we'll see. I think they were kind of established as the favorite. So maybe they're less of a favorite, but I don't think that necessarily changes their ceiling.
Yeah.
We'll have to see.
Yep.
We will see. All right, Matt, let's get out of here with a word of thanks to our great supporters on Patreon, including 2 new members this week at the Great Job Team tier, Greg Thomas and Brian Lane. Thank you so much for joining us here, supporting what we do with the show, with the site, keeping everything in front of any paywalls, without any advertisements. We are 100% viewer supported, and we are grateful. You can head to patreon.com/D3 Datacast for more information on the Patreon platform and how you can use that to support our efforts.
We appreciate that, guys, and we appreciate everyone who has partnered with us. It's been fun to get into the season. Cannot believe we're already approaching the middle of December on week 6 episode. So we're going strong for sure. Zach, this was another fun one. We got to get out of here. We got to say, though, good job, team.
Good job, team.